Hello class, in this lecture we're going to be studying about food and hunger, and the chapter in your textbook that goes over food and hunger talks a lot about food production and how that connects to different ecosystems. When we consider hunger, we're going to be thinking about large portions of the global population that lack access to food on a daily basis. So this slide has like an infographic that tells you that nearly 1 in 8 people in the global population experience chronic hunger. That means they're often going without a meal, often going a day without access to, stable nutrition. And so if we think of where these people are located, 870 million people, they're often in rural areas, so they're not necessarily near places where they have access to food. So oftentimes they're using farming or agriculture as their main source of food. And we're going to go over that in a little bit more detail in the upcoming slides. So we're going to begin our study of food by looking at different types of crops. And when we think of all the variety of food that we eat, when we consider staple foods, we're talking about the main sources of energy, meaning if we were to think of things that are usually carbohydrate rich and usually cheap and easy to grow, those would sort of be the main staple foods of most countries. So this would include things like rice, wheat, which we use for flour, potatoes, different types of potatoes, sweet potatoes. In a lot of Asian countries, they may have even different types of purple potatoes, maize or corn, cassava flour. So these would be the primary sources of food in lots and lots of different countries. If we look at a lot of Asian countries, we might notice more of a reliance on things like rice. If we look at portions of sub-Saharan Africa, they depend a lot on things like yams and potatoes. In large portions of South America, corn would be a major source of food, lentils, beans. So these staple foods really form the majority of the energy source for the population. And especially when we look at people that are experiencing poverty and hunger simultaneously, they're going to depend on access to the staple food crops to really keep them in a position of having food security, meaning keep them in an area where they are able to access food on a daily basis. So when we think about food security, we want to cover 4 major issues. So these aren't the only important issues when we consider food security, but these are really important ones. So your textbook goes into more detail about this as well, but we're going to focus on availability, access, utilization, and stability. Okay, so we're going to go through each one of those a little bit more closely. So we're going to begin by looking at food availability. And when we consider how much food is available and how much food people need, we want to see if those two quantities match up. So if we counted all of the food that's made in the world, and then we calculated how much food people need, we are producing a sufficient amount of food to feed everyone. The problem is the distribution. So, for example, we have the food, but it's not necessarily distributed equally. And why is that? Why is it that in certain countries we're producing more food, and in other countries, let's say, for example, in Haiti, we're not producing enough food? What causes those differences in availability? So let's go over some of the reasons for why food availability is different in different global populations. One of the reasons has a lot to do with pests and insects and a lot of diseases that are related to food production. And so a lot of that has changed, especially in the last 20 years. And the amount of food that can be grown on a given plot of land also changes. So the amount of nutrients that can grow from the soil change depending on the amount of fertilizer that's used, the types of pesticides that are used, the quality of the air, the environment around it, what other sources are using some of that land. So for example, the production of fossil fuels uses lots and lots of land, and so that compromises the amount of land that can be used for agriculture to grow food. If we look at where people put in money for research, it's often more related to things that can be sold for a higher profit. So for example, the production of fossil fuels generates more profit than the production of food. So when we consider global availability, there is a lot of food available, but the real issue comes with the areas in poorer countries where food is not produced at a level that's really sustainable for the poorest citizens to be getting access to food. And that really leads us to the next item that we're going to look at, which is access. And so when we look at it at a national level, we're really not only thinking about how much is produced in that country, we're also looking at, can people that live at the lowest income level, can they access the food? Because oftentimes in a country where there's plenty of food produced, that doesn't guarantee that people living, for example, at under less than $1 a day actually are able to access that food, right? So there's two different things we want to look at. One is the amount that's available, but then more importantly, if the food is available, can the most marginalized people in that population actually access the food, right? And so oftentimes we want to think about what citizens want to eat, right? What would they want to access, and then can they afford it, right? So for example, if they're trying to buy rice and potatoes and corn and beans, do they have the earnings and do they have the income to actually be able to afford that food? That's what we would refer to as access. So if you have an income where you earn enough money to access the food that you want, and that food is available in that area, then that would mean you have a good level of food security. Another important issue that we want to think about is utilization. And utilization has to do with how the food is distributed. And what we find when we study a lot of issues connected to how people eat and what food is consumed, we find that oftentimes there's a difference between what different individuals need to eat, right? So if we considered maybe the nutritional needs of a young girl that's 8 years old and maybe an older man that's in his 40s, right, that maybe is doing heavy physical labor, there are different nutritional demands in terms of what their body physically needs, right? In addition to that, there's also differences culturally between who eats what, right? So in certain cultures, certain types of protein are oftentimes reserved for the men. That may or may not be something that you've ever experienced. It may not be as common in the United States, but specifically in parts of Southeast Asia, women are often only really brought to the table or given access to the food after others in the family have eaten, meaning like after the men have eaten, after the children have eaten. And oftentimes a lot of the more expensive proteins are consumed by the men or the children, and so they would oftentimes save those for others, and then the women sometimes are experiencing specific types of vitamin deficiency or a lack of nutrients because they're oftentimes not the number one priority in terms of what food gets utilized in the home. So oftentimes that can lead to issues during pregnancy. For example, when women are deficient in things like folic acid or fat-soluble vitamins. So when we think of utilization, now we're really thinking of maybe the family has access to food, maybe there is food available, food is in the home, but now how is it utilized within the home, right? So there's a lot of different variables to consider. And then we come to the issue of stability. So if we were to describe a family, for example, or a household as being food stable, that would mean that the family has enough food, they have good access to food, the food is utilized well, the food is available to them, and they are sure that, for example, if there was a rainy season, that they would have enough food through the next season. So that means that they're not having such a small amount of food that they're just one famine or one natural disaster away from starvation. So food stability would mean, for example, if you were thinking of a home in the United States and you would think, okay, they have food in their pantry, they have a little bit of extra, they may have, a freezer with extra food in it, for example. Whereas food instability, we would consider people that really don't have those backup reserves. They don't have things stored, like let's say nuts or dried fruits or flour or dried beans or rice. Instead, they have just the amount of food that they could eat for the day, right? So when we refer to people that lack food stability, if you think of people that are suffering from hunger, we often would examine them biologically in terms of malnutrition. And malnutrition is when usually a patient that has malnutrition, or they're sometimes referred to as being undernourished, they will not have the same amount of the essential vitamins and minerals in their body that they need. So for example, things like sodium, potassium, vitamin A, D, E, K, vitamin C, vitamin D. They could be deficient in any one of those things, and so that lack of essential nutrients really makes it difficult for them to sustain good and proper health. So we consider someone that's food stable to be someone that has all of those things, and then when someone lacks that stability, we would describe them as being malnourished. So that first part of the textbook really focused on hunger and the different populations that sort of face hunger on a daily basis. And then the next section in the book really talks about food production. So we've moved from thinking about how people eat food and how much food they have to now thinking about how does that food get produced, and why are some countries able to produce so much food and other countries aren't, right? So this leads us to a discussion of things like genetic engineering and biotechnology. So oftentimes these are words that have a lot of negative connotations, right? People think of genetically modified organisms or GMOs and worry a lot, and that's sort of a natural reaction. And so what we're going to do in these upcoming slides is kind of explain how genetic modification began, and some of the things that are potentially problematic and other things that are relatively normal. So modifying crops or adjusting what types of crops would grow is really common and has happened for thousands of years. So in breeding lots of different plants, fruits, vegetables, breeding things in a desired way to get a desired outcome is really common. So for example, if you talked to a horticulturalist, it would be really common to breed different types of plants together to get a modified crop. So you could think of a simple example like putting together maybe a red flower and a white flower to get a kind of pinkish shade of flower, right? Those would be really traditional things that are really harmless that have happened for hundreds and hundreds of years. A lot of our livestock, so if you think of large populations of cattle, lots of the fruits and vegetables that are grown, a lot of them were developed by genetic modification. So these modified organisms don't really look like their previous generations. Right, we would talk about those as their ancestors. They don't really look the same anymore because they've been modified so much. So for example, wheat has been modified so much that it doesn't necessarily look like the ancestral strains of wheat. So what's an example of this? Well, one example of this is maize or corn. It actually was developed from a wild species called teosinte. And so here on the left side of the slide, you're seeing teosinte, and here on the right side, you're seeing what we use today as modern corn. And that little picture here is of a quarter, and you can see that the teosinte was really small, so it's just about a little bigger than a quarter. And here you're seeing the quarter is really tiny, and the ear of corn is huge, right? So we actually have a video right below the lecture video that you can learn more about how teosinte was developed into corn, and you can learn a lot more details about how that happened in Mexico. And it's really interesting to learn about the history of corn, especially when so many populations depend upon corn as a primary food source. So thousands of years ago in southern Mexico, teosinte plants were crossed with other plants to get the most desirable traits, and then that developed into what we now know of as corn, right? And so that would be an example of natural genetic modification, right? And so that video is linked right below the bottom of this lecture video, and so you'll be able to watch that and learn some of the really interesting features of how one of the earliest examples of genetic modification occurred. So what about an example where plant breeding is done in a really traditional, natural way? So here, for example, you see a person with a pair of tweezers, and they are connecting the pollen, which is like the male part of a plant, with the ovary, which is the female part of a plant, and by connecting those, that would be like plant reproduction, right? So the traditional plant breeding process is basically putting in the genes from one plant into the genes of another. So here would be the genes of one plant. You could see this orange strand of DNA. And here's the genes of another plant. That would be this green strand of DNA. All plants have DNA. It's not as complex as ours, but it's still DNA. And if we mix these two together, now the resulting offspring, meaning the next generation of flowers, would now have a new variety of DNA where you have the green and the orange mixed together. And so this type of breeding has happened for centuries, right? For hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is really common. Farmers have done this for thousands of years to ensure that the correct types of crops grow. So what's the difference between that and genetic engineering? So here's genetic engineering with that same type of example where you had an orange strand of DNA and a green strand of DNA. The difference with genetic engineering is that we're really narrowing the introduction to just one or a few genes. So rather than pulling off a large portion of this orange strand of DNA, instead we're narrowing the genes and introducing just one new gene. So when scientists do this, they're being very, very specific about which gene is introduced into the new plant or the new organism. So being very specific and very careful about which genes are introduced into the next generation ensures that only the specific desired gene is transferred, right? So you're really being very deliberate about how a new species is generated, right? And this can be done with any type of fruit, any type of vegetable. So I know sometimes students are surprised, but even something like a banana has DNA, right? Even an onion has DNA. It's not like our DNA, but it's still DNA. So you can mix certain types of plants together, strains that are compatible, and then produce a new variant strand. So sometimes this can be used in a really positive way, right? The reason that a lot of this has been embraced by agriculturalists is because this form of genetic engineering can be really helpful to prevent crops from getting damaged. So, for example, in Hawaii, one of the fruits that's exported are papayas. And there was a virus that was affecting a lot of the papayas in Hawaii. And one of the scientists realized that they could genetically modify the papaya in a way that it would resist the virus. So then by introducing that new genetically engineered strand of papaya, you were able to produce papayas that wouldn't catch that virus, right? And so then they could produce more papayas, and that would allow them to gain more profit. So oftentimes it's difficult to sometimes understand why this type of genetic engineering takes place or to understand what's the purpose of it, but a lot of times it's to protect the crops. A lot of times it's to produce a better organism, right? We're not saying whether that's good or bad, but it's good for us to understand the reason why this form of genetic engineering exists, right? Why are plants modified? And the majority of the time it's to produce a better product or to protect the crop from some form of insect or some form of damage. So what are some benefits, right? You've often probably heard about a lot of the negative things that can happen as a result of genetic engineering, but are there any positive things that can happen? Yes, there are some good and bad things, right? So it's good to kind of learn about the advantages and the disadvantages, and then you could make a decision about what your personal opinion is, right? So, and the textbook does a really nice job as well of kind of sharing the good and the bad, and then leaving a lot of the decision making up to you to have an informed opinion, and then to make really educated choices when you're purchasing your own food. Okay, so what are some benefits of genetic engineering? One is enhanced nutrition. So can we actually genetically engineer something for it to be more nutritious? Yes, there are examples of that. So here in this picture, you're seeing two varieties of rice. This is regular, normal white rice. And then here on the right-hand side, you're seeing something called golden rice. And this golden rice is fortified with a lot of vitamins. So it would be sort of like, this wouldn't be a completely correct analogy, but you could kind of imagine it like a multivitamin being added and mixed into that rice. And for a lot of populations that subsist on a cup of rice or 2 cups of rice a day, that enhanced nutrition is really helpful when they aren't getting sufficient nutrients anywhere else in their diet. So that can be really helpful. Cheaper production. Oftentimes the genetically engineered plants can be produced with less money, right? And with less pesticides and with less insecticides that are sprayed, because oftentimes they are more resistant to pesticides. So those would be some benefits of genetic engineering. So we've talked about some of the advantages of genetic engineering. Now we want to look at what are some of the disadvantages? What are things that people are concerned about? Well, one of them is interbreeding a lot. So when you start genetically engineering one strand of DNA with another strand of DNA, you're interbreeding more different types of species and different strands of DNA together. So that can be concerning. There's also the concern of, will a consumer purchase this, right? Consumers have a choice to purchase or not purchase genetically engineered organisms. And so if there isn't enough of a market, that can be concerning. We also don't know long term how this could change the ecosystem and maybe the makeup of the ecosystem. We don't know things like how it can be connected to human health. What are the effects on our health? There are people that have tried to track what the effects are on human health, but again, it's difficult to pinpoint whether it was the genetically modified food or was it something else in their life. Was it maybe being a smoker or drinking, or there's lots of other health factors, like maybe their family was predisposed to have a particular health condition. So there's a lot of different factors to consider, but there are people that are very strongly in favor of genetic engineering, and there are people that are very concerned about genetic engineering. So it's good to be aware of both sides of the issue. So one of the groups that attempted to determine whether or not genetic engineering is safe is NASEM. That's the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the United States. And they looked at hundreds of different research articles on genetic engineering, and they studied those and came up with their consensus, which was that there was no evidence of harm to the ecosystems and no evidence of harm to human health as a result of genetically engineering crops. Now, some people agree with this research, some people don't agree, right? And ideas really vary from one part of the world to the other. In the United States, we use a lot more genetic engineering than, for example, the UK, where there's a lot of hesitancy to use genetic engineering as freely as we do in the US. One of the areas that the NASM report focused on was corn. So BT corn is a type of corn that's been genetically engineered to produce a specific bacterial protein. So that bacteria is called Bacillus thuringiensis, and that's where the BT comes from. And initially, when scientists were doing research, they found that the pollen from the BT corn could potentially harm the caterpillars that eventually turn into monarch butterflies. If you've ever seen the really pretty butterflies that are orange and black, those are the monarch butterflies. And scientists were concerned that ecosystems could be affected because the pollen would hurt those caterpillars. When scientists did more research, they found out that a lot of the BT corn wasn't harmful to those caterpillars that would eventually turn into butterflies, but it was just one specific strain of the bacteria that was harmful. And so they removed that one strain of BT corn but kept the rest of it. And so scientists began to really question, should we be using genetically engineered crops? Is it really a good solution? And some of those advantages, things like, maybe they can produce rice that has more nutritious value. Maybe they can prevent diseases from spreading. Maybe they can produce a lot more food. A lot of that, although those are advantages that are connected with genetic engineering, a lot of it hasn't necessarily been possible. We haven't necessarily been able to do all of those things successfully. And so, unfortunately, there have been a lot of the negative effects where there is still the effect of pesticides. There's still the use of insecticides. There's still exposure for those harmful chemicals for agricultural workers. And so there's really still a lot of debate about whether or not genetically engineered crops are good and whether or not we should be using these genetically modified organisms in our food. And so you may have seen sometimes on a label they'll write non-GMO product, and so that means that there's nothing in that product that's been genetically modified. So that's something that you can really read up more about it. You can read more in your textbook, and then you can make decisions yourself as a consumer, right? What do you believe? What do you think is safe maybe for you, for your family? And so one of the things that I hope you will do as you go through the material in this course is really choose to make an educated decision where you look at the pros and the cons, the advantages and the disadvantages, and then you make a really educated decision for yourself. When we look at BT corn and non-BT corn, here's a picture. The BT corn on the left is the genetically modified organism, and then the non-BT corn on the right, you can see that it's more susceptible to things like fungus growing, it's more susceptible to pests eating it. So again, a lot of these genetically modified organisms do have some benefits in that it produces crops that farmers are able to grow more consistently, right, compared to some of the older strains that are not genetically modified. That's just a visual picture, just for you to be able to know what one looks like and what the other one would look like. So some of the great examples of genetically engineered crops are things like those papayas that we mentioned in Hawaii and how they were able to grow without being affected by the virus. Another great example is the golden rice, where they could add nutrition and add vitamins and minerals into the rice so that people that are eating that rice would have a lot more nutrition and a lot more energy than people that were just eating plain white rice. And those are great examples, but they're not necessarily the norm. Not all of the genetically engineered crops have been able to do this, so just because something's genetically engineered doesn't mean it has more vitamins, right? And so some of them haven't really been helpful in reducing rates of hunger or reducing food security. So the textbook really does a nice job of posing these as questions that you can think about. Has this been successful? Maybe we have a few good examples, but maybe it hasn't been worth the risk. Or some people would say, maybe if we continue to do research, it could improve, right? In the future, maybe there will be more examples like the golden rice, and maybe it's worth the effort that we're putting in, and maybe it's worth the potential risk, right? That's really where there's a lot of debate. So when we think about food and the connection between the production of food, genetically engineered organisms, and then the overlap between those things, what we find that really connects ecosystems and poverty and food is that if there is a way to produce more food at a cheaper price and increase the access, then that's really what people agree upon, right? Everyone agrees that we should produce enough food so that people all have access to it, and that there's plenty of food that's nutritious that's available for people. Unfortunately, it's poverty that often determines whether or not people have food security or food insecurity. And so until we can produce food that is nutritious at a price point that people can afford it, right? It's difficult for people that live in rural areas on a small income to have access to healthy, nutritious food in a way that they can make sure that their whole family has food security and that they have stable, consistent access to proper nutrition. So that's sort of the goal. We haven't accomplished that yet. A lot of times some of the things that we study in the course can be somewhat negative. We can often kind of look at things and think, oh no, everything's getting worse and everything is so kind of gloomy and negative and pessimistic. But there are some good trends that have been established in the last 20 to 30 to 40 years. And so when they talk about the next 20 to 30 to 40, 50 years, the good news is that although global hunger rates are still high, they are lower than what they were in the past. So, for example, if we think of the percentage of people that were hungry in the United States in the 1960s, it was around 25%, and then the percentage that were hungry in 2017 is 14%. Right? That's still a lot of people. We're not saying that that's a good number, but it's at least decreasing. In 1990, global hunger was as high as 35%, right? It was a far more pervasive problem. And in 2015, rates of starvation are at 10%. And so hopefully in your lifetime, you will see that population of people that are experiencing hunger go even lower, right? So as we go through this chapter and look at this material, hopefully that's encouraging to know that food production rates and access to food is better than it was in the past, and then hopefully in the years to come, it will continue to improve. So that brings us to kind of the end of this chapter. It's a little bit of a shorter chapter compared to the other ones in our textbook. What you want to do now is watch the video about corn that's posted in Canvas. And as you go through the chapter and read it, feel free to let me know if you have doubts about anything, or if you have maybe an opinion that you want to share about genetically engineered food. That would be really interesting. If you have an article maybe that you've read or that you're interested in, that's also a great way to connect to the material more. Later on in the semester, at the end of the semester, we'll be having an extra credit project opportunity. And that extra credit project is basically to write a report about an article that connects to material that we've learned in the class. And a lot of students in previous semesters have chosen articles that connect to genetically modified foods or genetic engineering, and you don't have to pick that, but if this is an issue that's interesting to you, if you read some articles online that are that kind of pique your interest, maybe bookmark them or save them so that when we get to the later point of the semester where you're choosing an article for your extra credit report, that you'll have one ready. Okay, so that's just something to be thinking about. It's not due yet, but later on in the semester it will be. Okay, so we've come to the end of our lecture. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a great day.